Regarding the inspections that is being talked about within the understanding between the P5+1 and Iran in the final deal, they're supposed to inspect the full fuel cycle of Iran's nuclear program. Is it in the IAEA's purview to also inspect some suspicious sites that has not been officially declared?
Well, under the additional protocol, the IAEA can request to see sites and people where they have reason to believe that they relate to a nuclear activity, in particular whether it relates to any fissionable material, enriched uranium or plutonium. So the additional protocol gives the agency a much wider latitude, but it also comes out then with a greater authority and greater credibility. I mean, the additional protocol was worked out under my time as Director General in order to make the safeguards more credible, because safeguards that are not thorough, safeguards that are cosmetic, they are worse than no safeguards at all. And therefore, it's a great progress that more than 100 states have accepted the additional protocol, and that we would anticipate the Iran also to accept it under the agreement now being negotiated.
I don't know if you have seen the information that the IAEA says it has on Parchin military site in outside of Tehran or not, but do you think a visit of that site should be among the conditions that Iran should accept?
Well, you have the need to clarify some past activities, and the acceptance by Iran for the IAEA to go to Parchin once, I think, was a step to meet that need. And there may be a need for further visits, but I can also understand that if Iran doesn't want to have an unlimited number of visits to something that is a military site, and I cannot see that the IAEA should have a need for such a thing. In other contexts, one talks about managed access to things, because there may be sites that are containing military confidential things that no country would accept having inspected, unless they were defeated in war, as in Iraq was. I mean, in the case of Iraq, we could go to the offices of the secret police and we go to the ministries, but that kind of inspection, I think, cannot really be anticipated that any free country would undertake.
Sir, would you please define managed access?
Well, managed access is to make sure that the inspector will see what is relevant from the point of view of non-proliferation, but that other things will be shielded from it. There may be a big installation, and there may be a lot of military activities or processes that states do not want to reveal, and I think that will go for all states, and they can then be shielded somehow and hidden somehow, and the parties should agree to how that will happen. That's how they manage it.
I see. Regarding the centrifuges and how much Iran will be allowed to maintain in operation, do you think this 6,000 number will be sufficient to both meet Iran's demands and also to allay the concerns of the West?
Well, it seems that the figure of 6,000 is sort of acceptable or tolerable for both sides, and that's what compromises are about. I think Iran would have liked to retain more. On the other hand, Iran doesn't need more centrifuges than they need amount of enriched uranium for the consumption of the power reactors in Bushehr and the Triga reactor outside Tehran. And I'm sure that the 6,000 would be enough. Iran did have a capacity for enrichment that seemed to go far beyond what the peaceful needs would be. I mean, a country like my own, Sweden, has 10 nuclear power reactors in operation. We don't have any enrichment at all. We import all the enriched uranium. South Korea, I think, has 20 nuclear reactors, and they don't make any enrichment. They import it all. But Iran did have bad experiences of a denial of purchases in the 80s, when after the revolution they were stopped from buying fuel for the Triga reactor. They eventually succeeded in getting from Argentine. So that's the background while they want to have self-reliance. But the self-reliance need not be greater than what they will consume in the immediate future and the next future. It will take a good number of years before they get new reactors coming.
Regarding Iraq, don't you think it would have been possibly better to totally convert it into a light water reactor rather than maintaining it as heavy water and just redesigning it?
I'm a lawyer and not a technical or scientific nuclear man, so I couldn't really advise you on that. But from what I understand from the negotiations, there seems to be an agreement that an adaptation from the current construction, but still retaining heavy water, would be satisfactory. What they want to attain, that I understand very well, and that is to reduce the amount of plutonium that would be produced in the reactor. Because plutonium can also be used for weapons purposes. But one must remember, however, that such spent fuel from a research reactor with heavy water would have to be separated. They have to be reprocessed to become of any use for weapons purposes. And Iran does not have a reprocessing plant, and I think it's also ready to commit itself not to reprocess any of the spent fuel. So there should allay any fears that Iran would take a plutonium path to a weapon.
So you just mentioned that you were a lawyer. So given the background regarding the sanctions relief, especially the international sanctions, the UN sanctions, how would that work? What kind of a mechanism would it be? And when do you think that aspect of the sanctions should be lifted?
Well, there are many different kinds of sanctions and economic embargoes. You have the UN sanctions decided by the Security Council, and they will have also to be lifted or suspended by the Security Council as they agree in Vienna or in Geneva. Then you have sanctions that are imposed by Washington under American law, and that is in the hands of Congress and of US President. Then you have the embargoes on the purchase of oil introduced by the European Union, and the European Union will be a master of that. So there will be a rather intricate operation to decide what is lifted and at what time, and there will have to be some sort of synchronization of it. Iran has said that they are not willing to undertake or perform their commitments on their side unless the commitments lifting sanctions are taking place on the other side. But I think one detail that from what I understand, is important, that even if an agreement is reached on the last of June, which we hope very much so that it will be done, it is not necessary that it enter into operation the same day. You can have rules about the entry into operation of the agreement at 6 months later, or even parts of the agreement can become operative at one date and other parts at another time. I would guess that the important thing is that there be a sort of reciprocity, that it's not a one-sided lifting of the sanctions or not a one-side restrictions observed on the Iranian side.
The IAEA provides technical assistance to many countries around the world in their nuclear activities. When do you think that would be possible with Iran? When would it be logical? Would the IAEA be able to provide this assistance as Iran is taking steps to live up to the possible agreement?
I can't remember that the parameters or the sheet issued by the European Union and Zarif, that they actually specifically talk about technical cooperation, but they do talk about international cooperation, and I think they do so in the context of Arak or Fordo or both. And I think that's a very important point, because it is not simply that Iran will want to have cooperation advice through experts from the IAEA or through the IAEA. It's also that international cooperation between Iran and the outside world and the IAEA will provide a transparency that is important. I mean, it's not unique to Iran. In the case of Europe, you have Urenco, which is a very big producer of nuclear fuel. That has been owned by Germany and Netherlands and the UK and perhaps some other country, and they thereby provide each other a transparency, insight into what's going on. And so the cooperation, not just for the benefit of getting results, but it's also for the benefit of transparency. And cooperation can take place in technical matters, but I think that cooperation in the field of safety is highly desirable for everybody. Everybody wants safety in nuclear activities. That goes for Iran, and it goes for the outside world of Iran. I'm sure that the Gulf states that are close to Bushehr, they will also are interested in the nuclear safety in Iran. And international cooperation of that, I think, is an excellent means of achieving it.
Do you think what's been set out in the parameters is logical, acceptable, and fair to Iran?
Well, you have to go through them one by one. I mean, there were things in the parameters that I think, at least to an outsider, would look a little odd if there were to be any kind of mechanism in the UN to be informed about Iranian imports of technical equipment or technical know-how. That's one thing. But if there were to be any kind of admission or approval, then it's another matter. So I think these things will have to be settled in the months to come. And I think it's very important that it be done. I think it would be very grave if they did not succeed in this. If it were not to have an agreement, I think both Israel and the Saudi Arabia and other states would be worse off if there were not an agreement. Then Iran would be free to enrich to other levels than they do now and to other quantities than they do now. And I think it's important that we start a process under which there will be cooperation, not only about nuclear, but also in other fields. And there could be great achievements in issues like the ISIS, like the Syrian issue, like Afghanistan, etc. So there would be great benefits from agreement, and there would be very serious drawbacks and dangers in not coming to an agreement.